Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz today is not merely a maritime dispute. It is a window, a rare and revealing window, into the structural collapse of American imperial strategy in the Persian Gulf, and the desperate measures being employed to conceal that collapse from a global audience that is increasingly unwilling to be deceived. What you are about to hear will not be found in the framing of Western media outlets, who have long since abandoned the pretense of objectivity when it comes to Iran. So stay with me, because the picture that emerges when you strip away the propaganda is far more complex, far more consequential, and far more damning of Washington's conduct than anything you will hear on mainstream television. On April 18, 2026, the Islamic Republic of Iran reimposed military control over the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically critical waterways on the face of this earth, just hours after a limited, conditional reopening had been offered as a gesture tied to what Iranian officials have described as a fragile and deeply asymmetric ceasefire process. And immediately, before the geopolitical dust had even begun to settle, the Western media apparatus lurched into motion with the same tired choreography we have witnessed for decades. Iran as aggressor, America as guardian, and the rest of the world as passive spectators to a morality play written entirely in Washington. But what comes next is even more revealing, because when you examine the actual sequence of events, the actual naval posture of the United States, and the actual terms being imposed on Iran through an illegal blockade of its ports, a very different story emerges. One that Western analysts are either too compromised or too cowardly to tell. Let us begin with the foundational reality that no American commentator seems willing to state plainly. The United States Navy is currently enforcing a blockade of Iranian ports. Not a sanction, not a diplomatic embargo, a naval blockade, enforced by Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, Aegis-equipped warships positioned to intercept, inspect, and turn back vessels attempting to reach Iranian territorial waters. This is, by any serious reading of international law, an act of war. It is not a pressure campaign. It is not measured leverage. It is a military siege of a sovereign nation's coastline, designed, as American officials have openly stated, to force Iran to the negotiating table on Washington's terms, not on any terms that reflect the legitimate interests or sovereignty of the Iranian people. And yet, when Iran responds to this siege, when Iran exercises what any nation under blockade would recognize as its right to assert control over its own adjacent strategic waterway, the response from Washington and its media allies is one of theatrical outrage. The aggressor performs the role of the aggrieved. This is not geopolitics, this is theater, and it only gets worse from here. Now, what actually transpired near the waters northeast of Oman on this particular day requires careful analysis. Not the sensationalist narration of a military entertainment channel, but the kind of sober, methodical examination that the gravity of the situation demands. Iranian naval forces, elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, engage commercial shipping in the vicinity of L'Irak Island, an area that sits at the heart of one of the most contested maritime corridors in the world. A tanker captain, according to intercepted communications, expressed confusion about clearance that had apparently been granted and then withdrawn. Western commentators seized on this audio with barely concealed glee, treating it as proof of Iranian chaos, Iranian unreliability, Iranian criminality. But let us ask the question that none of them are asking. Within what broader context did this incident occur? The context is this: the United States has maintained an aggressive naval blockade that is strangling Iran's economy, cutting off its oil revenues, and systematically attempting to coerce a population of nearly 90 million people into submission. Iran has watched its diplomatic gestures, including the partial reopening of the strait, go unreciprocated. Washington did not lift the blockade. Washington did not offer any meaningful concession. Washington pocketed the gesture and continued to apply pressure, because in the imperial playbook, a concession from the weaker party is not an opportunity for reciprocity, it is an invitation to demand more. And so when Iranian forces reasserted control over the strait, they were not acting irrationally. They were acting in response to a deliberate and calculated provocation, the continuation of an illegal blockade that the international community has been far too timid to condemn. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes. The figure of Mujtaba Khamenei has been thrust into Western discourse with the kind of dismissive mockery that reveals more about the intellectual poverty of American commentary than it does about Iranian political dynamics. Describing the son of the supreme leader as a cardboard cutout is not analysis. It is the language of someone who has no serious understanding of the internal dynamics of the Islamic Republic, the factional competitions within its political establishment, or the historical context that shaped the ideological commitments of its leadership. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the political philosophy of Iran's governing system, and there are legitimate critiques to be made from multiple directions, the casual contempt with which Western commentators dismiss Iranian leadership tells you everything about how Washington views the people of the region, not as historical actors with agency, grievances, and legitimate interests, but as obstacles to be managed, mocked, and ultimately crushed into compliance. This contempt is not incidental, it is structural. It is the same contempt that drove the CIA-orchestrated coup of 1953, the arming of Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, and the decades-long campaign of maximum pressure that has caused immeasurable suffering to ordinary Iranian civilians. And if you think that's surprising, the next part is even more significant. Let us talk about the hardware being deployed in this standoff, because the military pornography that dominates American commentary on this subject, the breathless enumeration of Tomahawk missiles, Spy-1 radars, A-10 Warthogs, F-15E Strike Eagles, and 30mm Avenger cannons, serves a very specific ideological function. It is designed to make the exercise of American military power appear inevitable, natural, and even exciting. It is designed to aestheticize coercion. When you spend 15 minutes describing in loving detail how an A-10 Thunderbolt's depleted uranium rounds would shred an Iranian fast boat from every hole, you are not providing military analysis. You are producing propaganda. Propaganda that normalizes the destruction of Iranian military personnel as entertainment, that renders the human beings on those boats invisible, that transforms a potentially catastrophic regional war into something resembling a video game. This is not a trivial observation. The dehumanization of the adversary is always the first step in preparing a domestic audience for escalation. We have seen this pattern before, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and the consequences invariably are borne not by the commentators but by the people whose countries are being discussed as targets. Now, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that the United States has positioned in the Gulf are formidable instruments of naval power. Nobody serious disputes this. The Aegis combat system, the SM-6 interceptors, the layered defensive and offensive capabilities of these vessels represent the cutting edge of American maritime technology. But military superiority, even when it is overwhelming, does not translate automatically into political victory. And this is a lesson that Washington has consistently refused to learn, despite Iraq, despite Afghanistan, despite 17 years of inconclusive operations across the broader Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is not the Pacific Ocean. It is a narrow, shallow, geographically constrained waterway, approximately 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, flanked by Iranian territory, laced with the potential for asymmetric engagements, and critically important to the energy security of nations, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea, whose interests are not aligned with Washington's desire to maintain a stranglehold on Iranian commerce. Any serious escalation in this waterway does not threaten only Iran, it threatens the global economy. And the countries that would bear the greatest costs of such disruption are not in Washington or London, they are in Asia, in the global south, in precisely those parts of the world that have been most vocally rejecting the American-led, rules-based order. An order, incidentally, whose rules seem to apply universally to everyone except the United States and its closest allies. But what comes next is even more revealing, because the strategic calculus being employed by Washington in this moment is not in fact as sophisticated as its proponents claim. The idea that maintaining a naval blockade while simultaneously conducting weekend negotiations will produce a durable, legitimate agreement with Iran is a fantasy. It is the fantasy of an imperial power that believes coercion and diplomacy can be conducted simultaneously, without one undermining the other. President Trump's statement that the United States will resume bombing if a deal is not reached is not the language of a negotiating partner. It is the language of an extortionist. And while the American media frames this as measured strength, any serious student of international relations understands that agreements reached under duress, at gunpoint, with a gun pressed to the temple of a sovereign nation, do not produce lasting peace. They produce resentment, resistance, and the eventual unraveling of whatever terms were imposed. This is not speculation. This is the consistent historical record of coercive American diplomacy across the developing world for the better part of a century. The incident involving the tanker Sanmar Herald, if we take the available evidence seriously and apply the kind of analytical rigor that the situation demands, raises questions that Western commentators are conspicuously uninterested in pursuing. Who precisely within the Iranian command structure authorized this engagement? Was it a coordinated decision reflecting centralized command authority, or does it reflect the kind of factional fragmentation that can occur within any military institution operating under extreme pressure? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and yet Western media has already delivered its verdict. Iran is chaotic, Iran is reckless, Iran is the aggressor. The possibility that some of this behavior reflects the impossible position in which Iran has been placed, besieged economically, threatened militarily, offered negotiations whose terms are dictated entirely by the party holding the gun, is simply not entertained, because entertaining it would require a level of intellectual honesty that the current media environment seems structurally incapable of producing. And here is what I want you to consider as we move deeper into this analysis, because this is where the conversation genuinely matters, not just for Iran, not just for the United States, but for the architecture of global order that is currently undergoing its most significant transformation since the end of the Cold War. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a symbol. It is a symbol of the contest between a unipolar world in which American naval power enforces American commercial and political preferences across the globe, and an emerging multipolar reality in which regional powers, imperfect, contested, operating within their own complex internal dynamics, assert the right to determine the terms of their own participation in the international system. Iran's control over the strait is not simply a military asset. It is Iran's most powerful reminder to Washington that geography, history, and the limits of imperial overextension are forces that no amount of Aegis radar coverage can simply override. Stay with me, because in part 2 we go even deeper into what these negotiations actually reveal about the endgame Washington is pursuing, why the blockade is about far more than nuclear weapons, and what the rest of the world, from Beijing to New Delhi to Riyadh, is watching and calculating as this standoff reaches its most dangerous inflection point yet. Let us pick up precisely where we left off, because the question of what Washington is actually pursuing in these negotiations is the question that unlocks everything else. And the answer, when examined honestly, is deeply uncomfortable for those who still cling to the narrative of American benevolence in the Persian Gulf. The nuclear file has always been, at its core, a pretext. This is not a radical claim. It is the conclusion that emerges naturally from a simple chronological examination of American policy toward Iran. When Iran had no serious nuclear program, it was still subject to American hostility, because the fundamental American objective in relation to Iran has never been nuclear non-proliferation. It has been the restoration of Iranian subordination to American strategic preferences in the region. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 removed Iran from the American imperial orbit. Everything that has followed, the sanctions, the coups attempts, the proxy wars, the assassinations, the maximum pressure campaigns, has been an effort in one form or another to reverse that outcome. The nuclear issue gave Washington a multilateral framework within which to pursue that objective. But the objective itself predates the nuclear file by decades. And if you think that's surprising, the next part is even more significant. Consider what the United States is actually demanding at this negotiating table. It is not merely a cap on uranium enrichment. It is not merely enhanced IAEA inspection protocols. The terms being sought, enforced through a naval blockade that is strangling the Iranian economy, include constraints on Iran's missile program, limits on Iran's regional relationships, and essentially the dismantling of the strategic deterrence architecture that Iran has spent decades constructing precisely because it has no other reliable means of protecting itself from American and Israeli military aggression. Iran is being asked, in other words, to disarm itself strategically in exchange for the lifting of an illegal blockade. This is not a negotiation. This is a demands list presented at gunpoint. And the idea that Iran, any Iranian government of any political orientation, could accept these terms and survive politically is simply disconnected from the reality of Iranian public opinion and Iranian historical memory. The Texas refinery announcement that emerged in the same news cycle as the Strait closure is worth examining, not as a footnote, but as a revealing data point about the economic architecture underlying this entire confrontation. The United States is not simply trying to contain Iran for abstract security reasons. It is trying to reshape global energy flows in ways that benefit American producers, American infrastructure, and American geopolitical leverage over the Asian economies that depend on Gulf oil. When Washington touts a new Texas refinery as proof that American energy is more reliable than Gulf supply, it is making an economic argument dressed in security language. It is telling Asian importers, China, India, Japan, South Korea, that dependence on the Persian Gulf, and by extension on a waterway that Iran can close, is a strategic vulnerability that American energy exports can resolve. This is 21st century mercantilism operating under the banner of freedom of navigation. And the countries being targeted by this message are not passive recipients. They are watching, calculating, and quietly drawing their own conclusions about whose interests this American naval presence actually serves. But what comes next is even more revealing. China's posture in this crisis deserves serious attention, far more than it receives in Western commentary, which tends to treat Beijing as either irrelevant or as a distant, malevolent observer. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China has signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement with Tehran. Chinese energy security is directly implicated by any prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And yet Beijing has been notably measured in its public statements, engaging in quiet diplomacy rather than open confrontation with Washington. This restraint is sometimes interpreted in Western capitals as Chinese indifference to Iran's situation. It is not. It is the restraint of a power that understands the difference between tactical patience and strategic abandonment. China is watching the United States exhaust itself in another Persian Gulf confrontation. China is watching the global majority, the nations of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, register once again the costs of American coercive diplomacy. And China is positioning itself methodically and deliberately as the alternative partner of choice for precisely those nations that are drawing the appropriate conclusions. The United States is not winning the broader strategic competition by blockading Iran. It is accelerating the fragmentation of the American-led order that the blockade is ostensibly designed to protect. India's position is equally instructive. Indian vessels have been among those affected by Iranian actions in the Strait. Indian energy security depends substantially on Gulf supply routes. And yet India has refused to align itself unambiguously with the American position. Because Indian strategic thinkers understand that signing on to Washington's coercive campaign against Iran means accepting American terms, not just for this crisis, but for the broader architecture of Indian foreign policy independence. New Delhi has spent decades constructing strategic autonomy, precisely to avoid the kind of binary choices that Washington perpetually tries to impose on the global South. The fact that India continues to engage diplomatically with Tehran, even as this crisis unfolds, is not a failure of Indian judgment. It is a demonstration of Indian judgment, and it is a data point that Washington strategists would do well to examine honestly rather than dismissively. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes. Let us address the question of Iranian internal dynamics directly, because it matters enormously for understanding what comes next. Western commentary has oscillated, somewhat incoherently, between two contradictory narratives about the Islamic Republic. The first narrative holds that the Iranian government is monolithic, centrally controlled, and capable of executing coordinated strategic decisions with precision. The second narrative holds that Iran is chaotic, factionalized, and incapable of honoring its own commitments. These two narratives are deployed selectively depending on which one is most useful for justifying the current American policy position. When Iran needs to be held fully accountable for an incident, it is monolithic and centrally directed. When Iranian commitments need to be dismissed, it is chaotic and untrustworthy. What neither narrative acknowledges is the obvious truth, that Iran is a complex political system with real internal debates, real factional competition, and real constraints on executive authority, operating under conditions of extraordinary external pressure. The behavior we are seeing in the Strait reflects that complexity. It does not reflect the simple moral fable that American commentators are trying to construct. The ceasefire framework that preceded this latest escalation was always fragile, not primarily because of Iranian bad faith, but because it was constructed on a fundamentally asymmetric foundation. Iran made gestures. The United States pocketed those gestures and maintained its blockade. Any serious student of conflict resolution understands that ceasefires which require one party to make concessions while the other maintains coercive pressure are not ceasefires. They are pauses. Pauses during which the stronger party attempts to extract maximum advantage before the weaker party concludes rationally that the ceasefire is not serving its interests. Iran's reimposition of Strait controls is not a betrayal of the ceasefire. It is Iran's recognition that the ceasefire was not functioning as a genuine reciprocal arrangement. Whether one agrees with Iran's decision or not, the analytical honesty to acknowledge this context is the bare minimum that serious commentary requires. President Trump's warning that the United States will start dropping bombs again if a deal is not reached is a statement that deserves to be taken seriously, not as tough negotiating rhetoric, but as a genuine indicator of the catastrophic direction in which this confrontation could move. A resumed military conflict in the Persian Gulf would not be contained. It would not be the clean surgical operation that American air power advocates perpetually promise and perpetually fail to deliver. It would implicate global energy markets, regional state stability, non-state actor networks across the Middle East, and the credibility of every diplomatic framework that the international community has attempted to construct around the Iranian nuclear question. The costs would be borne overwhelmingly by civilian populations. Iranian civilians, yes, but also the populations of every country whose economic stability depends on the uninterrupted flow of Gulf energy. This is not an abstraction. This is the concrete human consequence of the policy being pursued in Washington. And it only gets worse from here. What the world is watching right now, in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, is the terminal phase of a strategic approach that has failed on its own terms. Maximum pressure did not produce Iranian capitulation. The blockade has not produced Iranian surrender. Military strikes did not produce Iranian submission. What they have produced is a more hardened Iranian posture, a more consolidated domestic political environment around resistance to foreign coercion, a deeper Iranian integration into the alternative economic and security architectures being constructed by China and Russia, and an accelerating global conversation about the legitimacy and sustainability of American hegemony in the Persian Gulf and beyond. The United States is not losing this confrontation because Iran is stronger. It is losing it because coercion, applied without genuine diplomatic reciprocity, without respect for the legitimate interests of the party being coerced, and without a credible and attractive alternative to conflict, does not produce durable outcomes. It produces cycles. Cycles of escalation, de-escalation, and re-escalation that exhaust everyone except the populations that bear no cost for the policy decisions being made in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles from the Strait. The path out of this crisis exists. It is not comfortable for Washington, and it is not comfortable for those whose domestic political positioning depends on the perpetual vilification of Iran. But it exists. It requires the United States to acknowledge that Iran, like every sovereign nation, has legitimate security interests that must be addressed, not managed, not suppressed, but genuinely addressed in any durable diplomatic framework. It requires the lifting of coercive measures that have no basis in international law. It requires a negotiating process in which both parties make genuine concessions, rather than one in which American demands are presented as the universal standard of legitimacy. And it requires above all the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that 4 decades of American policy toward Iran have not served the interests of the Iranian people, the American people, or the stability of the broader region. That acknowledgement is not weakness, it is the beginning of actual strategy, as opposed to the performance of strategy that we have been watching at enormous human cost for far too long. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz will tell us whether Washington is capable of that acknowledgement, or whether it will continue down the path of escalation, with all the consequences that path inevitably carries. The world is watching, and increasingly the world is not watching with the deference and acquiescence that Washington has long taken for granted.